Since the Second World War, there has been an absence of wars between the great powers. Why, we may ask? Well, the easy answer is that nuclear weapons act as a perfect deterrence. No one wants to start a war because if they win, they will lose millions. Even if there's going to be a 99% chance that you're going to decapitate your enemy, even without reciprocal harm, do you really want to risk that 1% chance they'll be able to strike you back with nuclear weapons? This means that there has more or less been a mutual deterrence which prevented either side from starting a war between any of the great powers after World War II. This state is known as mutually assured destruction. Despite mutually assured destruction, there's actually been a few conventional wars fought between nuclear powers, though. The two most prominent examples are the 1999 Indian-Pakistan border war, the Kalergi War, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and the 1969 Soviet-Chinese border war. There's also been some very small border incidences between China and India and Pakistan. Of all of these examples, these wars have been confined to a small area with limited objectives. During each of these, there has been a dedicated diplomatic effort to end the conflict and prevent it from spreading further. Also, in India and Pakistan, there's kind of like this tit-for-tat escalation being observed. Traditionally people would view this kind of tit-for-tat escalation to increase the chances of the war expanding, but conversely, you could really say that it increases the ability for the war to de-escalate as it allows both sides to save face. Something which is very important for East Asian powers. The idea of mutually assured destruction preventing future wars from occurring actually predates nuclear weapons themselves. During the interwar period, the technological advance of bombers and the ability to conduct extensive bombing raids on enemy cities was thought to have the ability to preventively curtail wars from breaking out. Essentially, people realized mutually assured destruction before nuclear weapons, simply out of the perceived destruction which bombing raids would be. Mutually assured destruction has been observed during a conventional war in regards to chemical weapons. And that war was World War II. During World War II, all sides were abstaining from the use of poison gas, despite each side having extensive stockpiles, and Germany developing a tier of chemical weapons which were more powerful by an order of magnitude than its enemies. In the cases where it was used, it was against an enemy that didn't have an ability to strike back. This was by the Japanese against the Chinese before the expansion of the Pacific War, and the Germans against pockets of heavily dug-in partisans behind enemy lines. This use, in fact, is an exception which proves the rule, as chemical weapons were only used against enemies who couldn't use them back. The reality we find out if we look at nuclear warfare is that they've only been used against an enemy which couldn't retaliate. So Japan couldn't retaliate with nuclear weapons, right? During the Korean War, President Truman also forbade the use of strategic bombers on Chinese targets outside of the immediate theater of war. In effect, strategic bombardment was limited just like a weapon of mass destruction, in fear of it resulting in mutual escalation. So there is some possibility for a war to be conducted between great powers where each side doesn't use nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or even strategic bombardment. This has happened in our examples in 1999 and 1969, but could it happen on a theater level or any much larger level? Instead of a border war, could it be conducted over Europe or over the Pacific? If this could happen, everyone wants only one thing. That alternate history scenario, baby. I'm talking NATO versus Warsaw Pact. And right now, just saying, World War II Axis victory, that's for virgins. Real alternative history fans, they want that conventional Cold War, baby. You know what I'm talking about. That's what the Chads love. The center of Cold War hostilities was not ideology, if you really think about it, but territory, the division between East Germany and West Germany, and that is where the war would have been fought. Despite the global nature of the Cold War, the conflict would most likely be limited to one theater, Europe. We have two scenarios which have been mapped out in pretty extensive detail by people who know what they're talking about. First of all, I'm going to say, of course, the Polish government's released documents of 7 Days to the Rhine. And this is a scenario the Warsaw Pact modeled out where there's use of tactical nuclear weapons, but ultimately Warsaw Pact is able to win. And then I know that we think of Tom Clancy as a novelist, but he was an analyst before this. And you have Navy intelligence expert Larry Bond writing it with him. So these are pretty intelligent guys when they wrote Red Storm Rising. It's interesting that in both scenarios, the prime objective of the aggressor is to prevent the defender from reinforcing the European theater. In 7 Days to the Rhine, their scenario, NATO uses tactical nuclear weapons to isolate forward deployed Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces from receiving reinforcements from the Soviet Union itself. In Red Storm Rising, the Soviets use infiltration tactics to take Iceland and then use it as an airbase to deny American reinforcements and shipping to Western Europe. But judging by the quick speed of most modern wars, perhaps both of these are largely redundant, as many combined arms wars are won or lost in weeks and at best months. And I mean, let's look at the prime examples of combined arms warfare after World War II. In 1999 and 2003, you have the Iraq Wars. In 1971, you have the Indo-Pakistani War. And in 1967, and then a repeat in 1973, you have the Arab-Israeli Wars. These, when you think about it, really are the best examples of combined arms warfare used after World War II. And each of these examples, the war was very decisive, very quick, and it only lasted weeks. I mean, it's literally called the 6-Day War in 1967. Since the most likely war is a limited war in this scenario, restricted to the European theater, then these reinforcements from America, and to a lesser extent the Soviet Union, aren't really of any real quantifiable importance for how the war will be won or lost. Because in reality, with the way that combined arms work today, after World War II, it seems that the war would really be won or lost in a matter of weeks or even days. Let's now examine the forces at play in such a war and their doctrines. The Warsaw Pact, which is led by the Soviet Union, has a numerical advantage over NATO, but more importantly, they had an immense heavy weapons advantage over NATO. Soviet doctrine, as shown in 7 Days to the Rhine, was that tactical nuclear weapons would be used against military targets within the immediate theater on both sides. In nuclear warfare theory, it's important to know that there are two types of targets. You have counter-value targets and counter-force targets. Counter-value targets are soft targets such as large cities, and counter-force targets are military targets. The use of nuclear weapons against counter-force targets would be done to disable an enemy's ability to wage war. Counter-value targets would only be hit in a sustained nuclear exchange in a total war scenario or where a defeated power has no other option. It's important to note here that counter-value targets are things that nuclear weapons hold hostile as well. So if you're going to be engaged in this war and it goes to a nuclear standoff, both sides' cities are effectively held hostile as counter-value targets. In 7 Days to the Rhine, the Soviets anticipate that a nuclear exchange would be confined to counter-force targets within non-nuclear armed countries of the respective alliances. leaving French, British, Soviet, and ultimately American soil free of nuclear explosions, as direct attacks would ultimately lead to the targeting of counter-value targets and mass casualties between the nuclear-armed states. Believing that the use of tactical weapons was likely, the Soviet Union's forces were heavily armored, as they believed that the armor would provide protection from the blast, heat, and radiation at a distance. These heavily armed Soviet Union units were to act autonomously and far from command and control by bypassing NATO units and penetrating deep behind enemy lines. The American strategic doctrine, on the other hand, was known as air-land battle and focused upon direct air support for land units, emphasizing joint operations and using air power-based interdiction attacks to attack command and control supply dumps and infrastructure. Ultimately, this strategy was to delay a Soviet advance in order for American forces and NATO forces to take advantage on the local level and defeat Soviet units in detail. It should be noted that the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies always had a superiority in conventional armed forces within Europe. Initiative would always be with them, at least through the Cold War as we historically knew it. And the land-air battle doctrine is predicated on stopping the Soviet advantage. But I want to also note that towards the end of the Cold War, NATO's approach started to approach equity with Warsaw Pact forces, though ultimately they would never meet it. If such a war were to occur, it makes the most sense for it to occur between the 1970s and the 1980s, rather than earlier. This is because the West had a massive advantage over the Soviets in nuclear capacity in the 1950s and 1960s. And so the West doctrine was actually massive retaliation. Rather than trying to engage the Soviets or Warsaw Pact in a conventional war first, they would rapidly escalate into their superior use of nuclear weapons and destroy the Soviet Union through hitting counter-value and counter-force targets. So I would imagine, because the Soviets really don't have the ability to prevent nuclear weapons and some kind of tit-for-tat or mutually assured deterrence, they would be more cagey in a crisis in the 50s and 60s. But once the Soviets attained parity with the West, then a conventional war would become more likely, the 70s and the 80s. And American planners started to plan for a conventional war and ultimately would consider it likely. If this war were to break out, it would be largely limited to the European theater. The Pacific theater would likely to be contained with the Soviet Navy and Air Force staying close to their dock and air bases and not wanting Japan or South Korea to be drawn into the war. Of course, there's like a wild card here if North Korea would start the war on their own, or if China would see their chance and attack Taiwan. But in this scenario, I'm assuming that those two things don't happen. With such a heavy advantage given to the American military, its Air Force, and its Navy in the Pacific, it's hard to imagine that there would be any real naval battles in the Pacific. And even though in Red Storm Rising there's a large battle for the North Atlantic, it's also hard to imagine the Atlantic Soviet forces leaving their port as well. As, you know, not only did the American Army the American Navy, I should say, outnumber the Soviet Navy by a massive amount. I think that the French and the British Navy on their own were comparable to the Soviet Navy throughout most of the Cold War. So the Soviet Navy was really kind of like outnumbered and spread thin. So even if it wanted to, say, operate submarines or do the very LARPy thing that it does in Red Storm Rising of taking Iceland, it's pretty suicidal. I also want to say that the Soviet and American allies throughout the Third World would not become involved unless this was some sort of escalation out of an Arab crisis like in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. It's really hard to see that. Like I said, that's another just like a wild card you get, just like North Korea trying to reinvade South Korea, or China attacking Taiwan. Although you should say that if China attacks Taiwan, would that be its own separate war? Because the Soviet Union's not allied with China, especially after the Sino-Soviet split. So it would really be a separate war, and America would either engage in the separate war and draw it into the Third World War, or abandon Taiwan. I would think that they would abandon Taiwan. So I really think that this war would be confined to Europe. As the Soviet Navy, being restricted as it is, really can't help any third world allies. This is kind of pointless. Maybe the Australians or New Zealanders would help the Americans, but as I said before, there's no real reason that they would, you know, that they would join in, and then it would take so long for them to send their forces to Europe. Maybe they would enter the war but be neutral, or essentially be pointless and only have declared war. As for Vietnam, trying to go against the United States in the Pacific, suicidal. As for Cuba, the United States would probably preemptively invade them, seeing that there's already a naval base at Guantanamo. Cuban hopes would be pretty dim. It's funny, in Red Storm Rising, the Cubans declare neutrality knowing that they're doomed. So, as I've limited this war to Europe, there are 4 prospective fronts in Europe. We have Scandinavia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Germany. Ultimately, all would be sideshows except for Germany, though. Over Norway, only Norway was in NATO for Scandinavia, and an offensive within the Arctic Circle would be too difficult for either side, although we can expect some kind of air war. In the Balkans, the Warsaw Pact state of Bulgaria shared a border with the NATO states of Turkey and Greece. Turkish forces far outnumber Bulgarian forces, but how effective would the highly politicized Turkish military actually prove to be? And also, if you know anything about Greece and Turkey, the idea of them working together is kind of laughable because of the whole Cyprus crisis, and that Turkey and Greece have pretty significant claims on each other's territory after the War of Turkish Independence, making their long shared deep hatred with each other continue throughout the centuries and continue through the Cold War. So even they're both parts of NATO, it's hard to see them working together, and it's hard to see them in unison trying to invade Bulgaria. So I really think that this area won't matter, despite Warsaw Pact's weakness in the area. Keep in mind that Romania wasn't actually in the command and control infrastructure of Warsaw Pact, but the Soviet Union didn't station troops within Bulgaria itself. So if the Soviets didn't see them as a threat, then that probably meant that they weren't really a threat. So there probably would have just been a few border skirmishes between the two sides, and that was it. Now let's move on to the Caucasus. In regards to the Turkish and Soviet border there, both sides had very strong defensive positions, and the terrain would make any offensive suicidal, and it wouldn't be combined arms. It would be basically like the end of the Korean War or World War I. It would be trench warfare. So there again would be, some air war, probably some use of artillery and probing border battles, but not much more than that. The Balkans and the Caucasus, the southern flank of Warsaw Pact, would probably only result in phony wars. There probably would be some kind of air war over Norway, and if the Soviets did attempt to interdict American supply routes and start their own battle of the North Atlantic, well, Norway would be important. But again, as I said before, does that really matter, since such a war as we've observed throughout most of history would be pretty short. So that leaves us with the German front as the most important front. And the division of the two countries and the city of Berlin was the most salient flashpoint of the entire Cold War. There are two routes of attack for the Soviets, who always had the initiative in conventional warfare: the Fuda Gap and the North German Plain, both of which the Soviets would have used simultaneously if we use 7 Days to the Rhine as our example. The Soviets would have also, even using 7 Days of the Rhine, they do this, invaded Austria and violated their neutrality, opening up a third route. So it's pretty funny to me that even in 7 Days to the Rhine, that they violate Austria's neutrality. What is going to matter in this short, conventional, regional war is how far the Soviets are going to be able to push and what they can get once a ceasefire is called. The Soviets have a force advantage, especially if it lasts a few weeks or months. The length of the Soviet advance depends on how well NATO troops are able to coordinate to delay it. It also depends on how well the Soviets are going to be able to organize themselves in their advance and how much they will trip themselves up through an overabundance of units. I think the advantaging on the Soviet side or the Warsaw Pact side is overwhelming, because the ability of NATO's air force to limit Soviet logistics actually was kind of minimal. Initially, I thought that the Soviets would not be able to advance into Germany, but looking into it more, that's not true, because I thought that the air force of the Warsaw Pact would be greatly inferior to the air force of the NATO forces, so that the Warsaw Pact air force would be grind down into dirt, and then NATO forces would gain air superiority and force the Warsaw Pact forces into the defensive. I guess that's all bullshit, though. There's very good reason to believe that NATO would not be able to gain air superiority. And if they did so, their superiority would not be effective enough to interdict Soviet forces and disrupt their supply routes. That is because Warsaw Pact air forces were actually comparable to NATO air forces, and would have actually initially outnumbered them within the theater itself. Their technology was of equal quality by the 1970s and 80s. While NATO forces would probably have been superior on a plane-to-plane level because of their better training, this one advantage would be utterly outcast by two significant advantages given to the Warsaw Pact forces. The Soviet air defense systems were far more advanced than the NATO air defense systems, and SAM's surface-to-air missiles would have denied the NATO air force from cutting supply routes and damaging its command and control. Likewise, the Soviets had far more tactical non-nuclear missile systems that would have been able to harass NATO air bases and force them out of operation. On top of all this, despite the shittiness of Arabs in war, their Eastern European logistics systems, which the Soviets built for them and sometimes manned for them, either with Soviets or with Eastern European forces, actually functioned really incredible. If you're going to go into like the Chad-Libyan war, you have like Warsaw Pact members running the Soviet style logistics system, and the Libyans, despite how terrible they were and just being decimated by Chad forces, had, logistics systems which, I mean, were comparable to Western nations, if not superior to them. The feats that they did maneuvering in the Chadian desert and the Libyan desert are breathtaking, actually. So the Soviet push logistics system, even if the NATO gained air superiority, would still be able to function incredibly well. So, as seen, under strain, they work very well for the Arabs. So in Europe, they would have probably worked much better. And their quality would have meant that the NATO Air Force, even if it gained air superiority, would probably never be able to destroy the Warsaw Pact logistical system, or even give it a run for its money. The basic scenario outlined in 7 Days to the Rhine is that the NATO forces are unable to defeat the Soviet forces in the field, and as such resort to tactical weapons to destroy their logistical system. Western liberals, when seeing this, are very confused because they assume that the Soviets would be the aggressors. So why would NATO use nuclear weapons first? Is from their perspective, they are the peace-loving democracies, and the Warsaw Pact is the evil, aggressive dictatorship. But looking at from Soviet eyes, it really makes sense, as they believe that the only way for them to win, or lose, I should say, is that the Soviet logistical system is destroyed. In 7 days to the Rhine, the Soviets respond with tit-for-tat attacks against non-nuclear armed NATO states. They then are able to advance to the Rhine and then could attack France or not. Any use of nuclear weapons, even if modeled in the 7 days to the Rhine, would really be idiotic, as NATO planners believe that tactical use was ultimately pointless. Both sides would not have done first use, and if they had a tit-for-tat scenario, it would likely just end the war and de-escalate the situation, as contrary to popular understanding, as I said before, tit-for-tat stuff slows down the war and leads to a de-escalation of tensions. So if people are really able to see hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people dying in a tit-for-tat exchange of nuclear weapons, well then it'll probably end the war and lead to negotiation. The one wild card in all this, I think, is that the American superiority in satellite technology, and how that would affect the targeting of Warsaw Pact forces. I assume that the Warsaw Pact forces, and in particular the Soviets, would have better spies who would be giving information through the West European Communist parties, and this might offset the disparity in spying technology that the NATO had with satellites. Yet one wonders how well the Americans and NATO at large could exploit this superiority if they could not gain air superiority in the first place. It also should be noted that the armed forces of the United States were the weakest that they had been since the Second World War, during the second half of their engagement in Vietnam, so like 1970 to 1980. The 1970s were a very weak point, especially before the change to air-land battle. You had fragging, you had soldiers just refusing commands of their superiors, and this spread outside of South Vietnam to the entire Army and Marines. The Air Force and the Navy were pretty immune to it, but you had a breakdown of the command structure. You have fragging, which is the assassination of lower level officers, like lieutenants and captains and majors, are being killed while they sleep by their own men. And you have widespread use of alcohol and illicit drugs. At the end of the Vietnam War, and then the years following that, the American level of discipline and morale was extremely pitiable. So if the Soviets invaded at that time, given that they had parity with the United States in a nuclear war, the Soviets probably would have wiped this, wiped the floor with NATO. But after Reagan came to power, after land-air battle was incorporated into the American armed forces, the parity in morale and discipline improved within the American ranks, and the United States and NATO in general moved towards greater and greater parity with the conventional forces of Warsaw Pact as it went on. So, if this war happens in 1989, the Soviets are going to advance deep into West Germany. If this happens in, 1975, the Soviets are probably going to take all of West Germany, the Low Countries, probably Denmark, and maybe even parts of Italy, along with Austria. So this really kind of depends where you're putting it. But I'm always going to say, throughout this whole thing, at least within historical terms, maybe if it continued in the 90s, NATO would actually outgun Warsaw Pact. But in the 70s and the 80s, Warsaw Pact always outgunned them. It's important to note, as the 80s went on, recoilless rifles were used by NATO. And it's believed that these recoilless rifles, and I think it's Bingkoff, the YouTube guy, he talks about how the recoilless rifles would have slowed Soviet advance, and in Red Storm Rising, the recoilless rifles slow Soviet advance. But in the 70s, there still wasn't as many recoilless rifles, and as time went on into the 80s, the recoilless rifles, along with the further parity, would have slowed down a Soviet advance. So, again, though, the Soviets and Warsaw Pact throughout the entirety of the Cold War until the fall of East Berlin and free Hungarian passage to Austria always had superiority conventionally over NATO forces. To the war itself, the question of how much the Soviets would be able to advance into West Germany, Austria, Denmark, ultimately the Low Countries before a ceasefire. The question is, how far would they advance? The greatest limit to the Warsaw Pact may actually be how many forces they can commit and how much their own forces would be slowed down the more that they add into traffic jams. If the Warsaw Pact were able to attack preemptively, their forces would have concentrated on clear infrastructural links throughout West Germany. They were planned to completely ignore NATO units and act autonomously and capture these infrastructural links. Had the Warsaw Pact units not been surprised, they still would have had the initiative through the sheer force of numbers, but would have been slowed down considerably by Western powers practicing scorched earth warfare. I think the Soviets would likely never advance past positions in Germany and the Low Countries and never would have attacked France to any significant degree. And I mean, it's simple why they wouldn't do that. Because France had nuclear weapons. The whole strategy would have been to split the Allies diplomatically once they have taken enough land and to demand peace from a better bargaining position. I assume that the Soviets would have thought this would have been done through isolating France, since France wasn't in the NATO command structure. And then they would ask for separate terms with France, and then have very demanding terms of America and Britain over the fate of West Germany. Had they succeeded in doing so, separating France, they would have won the war, because that would mean that United Kingdom and in America, and Spain and Portugal and whoever's there would have to start naval invasions of the Low Countries, which is, that's a very costly thing to do over months. And like I said, would you want to extend a war with nuclear powers over months? If they weren't able to separate France and they weren't able to occupy all of West Germany, of course they're going to be in a very weak bargaining position. So either you have the Soviets taking West Germany and then having a very strong defensive position there, and then they force the Allies to negotiate and call peace talks first, or you have the Soviets not being able to advance far enough in West Germany and having a good defensive position, and then them calling negotiation and peace talks first. Because really, at the end, this is always going to have to end with a negotiated peace. This can't be a total war because of nuclear weapons. And really, it all has to do with if you're able to push the American forces out and prevent them from being able to reinforce NATO in the future and to erode future within the months and years to come, the Soviet numerical and material superiority through America sending its own forces to help Europe. Yet, though, because of the initial Soviet superiority and the deployment of its forces into an offensive situation, it's really difficult to envision NATO advancing into East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. So it's either the Soviets and Warsaw Pact is going to get cut down on the border and they're going to dictate status quo antebellum, as in Red Storm Rising, or they're going to dictate terms to NATO. As I said before, in the 70s, they would probably be dictating terms to NATO. As the 80s went on, it's more and more likely that you would end up getting a status quo antebellum. The Soviets, of course, aren't going to be able to dictate anything to force France, the United Kingdom, or the United States to do anything, as their nuclear forces would prevent the Soviets from dictating any concessions from them. An attack on Lyon or an advance all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains, even if it is modeled in the 7 Days of the Rhine, is just goofy. They had any substantial invasion of France, that being conducted as suicide because France would have clearly used their nuclear weapons to maintain their independence. Had the Soviets attained their goals, what would they dictate then? If you want to be LARPy, they would install, satellite states in Denmark or the Low Countries or Austria, and unify Germany under the Socialist Unity Party of the German Democratic Republic. Dance Dance Revolution. But I don't think this has happened for two reasons. First is that it would make the Soviets to the rest of the world, to the non-aligned countries, as the aggressors or the oppressors on the world stage. And second, then they would have to quasi-occupy even more states, as they already had to occupy most of Warsaw Pact with the exception of Romania. So it's just like, even it extends the Soviet Union even more. So if there was going to be territorial change, I think the Soviets would press heavily for West Berlin to join with the rest of Dance Dance Revolution. I say Dance Dance Revolution because the Democratic Republic of Germany's acronym is DDR. So I've always called it Dance Dance Revolution. But yeah, they would probably try to put West Berlin, I should say, into DDR, but they wouldn't try to make the Federal Republic of Germany annexed by the DDR because then they would have to occupy even more land, and they would be seen as the aggressors. But they do gain a lot if West Berlin joins, because the Germans themselves aren't going to have a brain drain problem through West Berlin, even if that was curtailed after the building of the Berlin Wall. And that is also going to mean that the Western powers aren't going to be able to force themselves to garrison through there. What they're really going to go for, I think, would be disarmament and Finlandization of the Warsaw Pact country, or not the Warsaw Pact countries, the NATO countries which were bordering Warsaw Pact. So they would want a neutral Germany, and that was their goal throughout the entire Cold War, is the disarmament of West Germany, its neutralization. And if they got a neutralized Germany, that's great, but even better would be a neutralized Denmark, because then the Denmark Straits wouldn't be militarized and cut off, Soviet ships in the Baltic from reaching the Atlantic. So if they could get the Danish Strait open, that would be cool. And if they could get the Low Countries Finlandized. Finlandized means, or Finlandization, is where Finland would not join NATO, and Finland would they would cower before the might of the Soviet Union in order to maintain their independence. So they would actually have commemorations of Soviet holidays and Soviet historical events, and be very, very puppet-like, even though they're not part of Warsaw Pact and they're not communists. They would, in their foreign policy, they would always defer to the Soviet Union because they feared them so much. So if you could have a West Germany which is unarmed and defers to the Soviet Union, that's fucking great. If you could have Low Countries and Denmark do that too, that's really good. And it's really much more advantageous for this to happen, as the Soviet Union wouldn't have to have a massive army, as it would have a neutral buffer zone along with its already militarized buffer zone. And this massive army and this massive military, that was, as we know in real life, was a huge cross to bear for the GDP investment that it had on the stagnating Soviet economy. So if you make West Germany Finlandized, there's no longer a direct invasion route or any direct stress between United States, NATO, and Soviet Union Warsaw Pact. Perhaps the Soviets or Warsaw Pact in general would try to get reparations, but any type of reparations would be secondary. If the Soviets were to win this weeks-long limited conflict, then the American power and prestige would diminish worldwide, and ultimately, I think it would lead to many countries. Some of them might lead NATO, but a lot of countries wouldn't trust America and its nuclear umbrella for their defense anymore, and they would seek their own nuclear weapons rather than being Finlandized. Spain or Turkey are probably going to go towards nuclear weapons. Italy too, and the Pacific allies like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, they'd probably go for nuclear weapons too. So ironically, an all conventional war in Europe would probably lead to increased nuclear proliferation rather than it would be an exception that would prove the rule rather than having people not trust in nuclear weapons. People would probably double down on using nuclear weapons for their deterrence here. So what I'm saying right now is that nuclear weapons are always going to prevent occupations. They're always going to prevent strategic department and the use of chemical weapons. But they're not going to prevent them from being short, decisive wars. So if we might want to step out of this alternative history, we should expect more and more border wars as America's power and hegemony diminishes between India and Pakistan and India and China, and that there to be border wars in the future, as I really don't think that nuclear weapons prevent border wars. So anyway, this is a lot of fun to talk about alternative history. And this alternative history is an alternate history that people don't talk about. I'm going to make a video in the future about Axis or German Victory alternate fiction, but, it's so done to death, and that one is so politicized. I just find it much funner. I find World in Conflict funner than, Wolfenstein. I find a lot of the novels pretty fun. I'm reading Red Storm Rising now. Just cool. Red Alert's a great game. It's funny that in video games, Soviet America Cold War, Soviet victory is pretty common. I mean, you got World in Conflict, you got Command and Conquer, Red Alert, and then you got, I think it's called Red Dragon or something. War Game Red Dragon. So a lot of RTSs really have this, but there's not too many first-person shooters, and there isn't very many strategic games where you have Axis victory, so that's kind of interesting. But you have a lot of books, and some of those are pretty fun. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, I really appreciate you guys watching this video. I'm trying to keep up on the content lately. So I'm going to be a fuckhead here, and I'm going to say this right now. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.